on data reuse. So that of the data producers, the data curators, and the data reusers. So this project is being done in collaboration with Elizabeth Yako, who unfortunately could not be here today. So I'm going to try to do the presentation justice. So one of the three perspectives that we're looking at comes from the archaeological discipline. So a little bit about archaeology in terms of its practice, what's going on in terms of changes, trends, and traditions. So there's a changing nature of the research questions, from in-depth focus on a single site to analysis of social, cultural, and economic trends across multiple sites, which leads to the need for more data. And when we're looking at collecting data across multiple sites, typically archaeologists can't do that in their single career. So data sharing, there's increased pressures around sharing data amongst the community. We also have the fact that more and more archaeologists are no longer able to remove artifacts from the country of origin. So that means that documentation and documenting over the time of the excavation of the survey has become much more important in terms of archaeological work. And then we talk about the data reuse tradition. So typically there's been substantial use of museum objects, and those objects are used as comparanda to try to identify newly found objects. Typically there's been little sharing in the community in terms of research data. When it does happen, it happens on a person-to-person, one-on-one basis. There are currently a couple of archaeological repositories out there, but again, there are still repositories that are relatively young. So in this project, we're examining, as I said, data reuse from three perspectives. So the perspective of the data reuser who's collecting and documenting that data and sharing it. The repository staff who are curating that data, so that includes processing, preservation, and dissemination. And then the data reusers. So those are folks who are conducting studies and they're using other people's data to be able to answer these new research questions. And so what was our research question for this case study? We were really interested in how actions in one part of the data lifecycle create challenges or facilitate work at other points in that lifecycle. So this underlying case study examines zoo archaeologists, so archaeologists who examine animal bones. And so we're looking at the point at which that data was shared to the point at which that data was published, and published by a person who reused that data to answer a new research question. And so the research questions that they investigate have really centered on the types of animals exploited by a culture. So if we think about animal domestication, it can signal change from a hunting and gathering to an agricultural economy. And so the zoo archaeologists that we followed worked or collected data or contributed and reused data across 12 sites in Turkey. And these sites documented communities anywhere from 20,000 to 3,300 BC. So our research design, this data was collected over about a year and a half. We interviewed the data producers and reusers before and after their reuse experience. We analyzed email threads among the data producers and the reusers, and these were typically emails that were exchanged with repository staff. We conducted a focus group with the data reusers, and we observed presentations resulting from data reuse. So they all gathered at a conference and shared their analyses that they had done. And then it also resulted in a publication, so we had that publication as well. In terms of data analysis, it was qualitative. We did coding, and we basically expanded our interview protocol and code book from previous work on another project that we're collaborating on called Dipper. So there we're also looking at reuse among data reuse in academic communities. And so two coders coded this data set, and they worked closely together to ensure consistency in coding. So in terms of our findings, really they do demonstrate that there are these interdependencies between different parts of the data lifecycle. And the actions taken in one part really do have an influence on things that occur in other stages. So broadly speaking, in terms of our findings, we found that repository actions are overwhelmingly positive, but they can't always reverse or explain data collection and documentation procedures. We also found ways in which factors related to data sharing affect repositories and reusers, and how acts of reuse can influence repository policy and data producers' later actions. And so I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail to give you a flavor about what we found. And as I said, the good news here is that repository staff can facilitate data sharing and data reuse. And they do this in a number of ways. In this case, one of those ways was standardization, or decoding or aligning diverse codes that producers used for these animal bones and teeth in this instance of this case study. And then it was integrating that data from different sources. So as the data reuser 9 says, integrating it to the extent it was comprehensible. Because in terms of zooarchaeologists and the way they work, they do things in a number of different ways because they come from different traditions. And so these kinds of things not only facilitated data reuse, but they saved time and effort in terms of the data producer who was sharing that data and preparing that data for sharing. As noted in the last quote, the repository staff did a lot of cleaning. That a data producer can do, but it would take a lot of time to do. So in terms of repositories not being able to reverse certain things in terms of the data up front in that life cycle, in terms of collection and documentation, there are limits. So one thing that came up is this idea of sampling procedures, and those things and how those things influence data reuse. So these really need to be identified for reusers down the line. So the researcher here sampled goat and antelope bones, but not necessarily other kinds of bones, so cow bones or data or pig data. And it was necessary for the repository to be able to add attributes, or what people call a dummy variable, to indicate whether or not things were sampled. And it's important because if a data producer only samples one type of bone at a site, it kind of it limits the kinds of analyses a data reuser can do. So for instance, this person talks about being able to calculate the number of identified and number of individual specimens for the total site. Well, if someone's only sampling one kind of bone, the reuser needs to know that, because then they can't do that kind of calculation. The other issue that came up is underspecified standards and how that impacted both repository staff and data reusers. And it concerned teeth and being able to categorize wear erosion in teeth. And so there's a person by the name of Payne that developed a system to identify the amount of tooth wear, and that's widely used in archaeology. And the stages are well described, but there aren't really guidelines in terms of how to document those. So it could be that you're identifying tooth wear and doing it for the whole specimen. Sometimes people identified it at the level of the individual teeth. When they coded that kind of data, they could code it in terms of one column in a spreadsheet or 4 columns. There really weren't guidelines on that, and that caused issues down the line. When we think about different kinds of data sharing factors that influence repositories, 2 that came up were data format and data condition. So data transformation from one system and one data format, we found caused multiple issues. So the quotation that you see here in terms of data format is really the beginning of a long back and forth between a data producer and repository staff in trying to understand what's going on. And so it turns out the format was a FileMaker Pro, and that needed to be changed or transformed into Excel. And what happened during that transformation is that entire records of bones had been duplicated in that effort, and that certain things mapped to the wrong columns. And it took several days of data processing and integrity checks to try to unravel all of that and fix it. In terms of data condition, it's really what form that data comes in to the repository. So there's an example in terms of repository time and how long the data processing takes. And so there was one data set that was coded, and that data set contained 20,000 bones. That took 10 times longer to process than a data set that had 100,000 bones that had been decoded. So the condition in which that data comes in is critical in terms of time and processing. Data sharing factors that influence data reuse. Data selection is key for reuse. And data producers, we found, withheld different fields in order to submit what they thought was a more coherent data set. So things that were typically taken out were notes fields. They were identified as candidates for deletion before sharing. And so the above quotation illustrates one data producer talking about and discussing his concerns with sharing his own notes. He eventually did it, but there was another producer who actually eliminated her notes entirely from the data set. She just changed her code, she said, and then she sent that off, and she deleted all of her comments because you can't quantify those. There wasn't anything really essential there, she said, so I deleted them. So the repository staff, this all came out during our focus group interviews, and repository staff actually expressed surprise that this came out in terms of the focus group. But it also demonstrates that context can be omitted, right, without the repository staff or the reusers actually being aware that it ever existed. In terms of data reuse, and that how that might influence future actions of the repository staff and data producers. Many of our participants had shared data before. This group actually knew each other and knew each other's work. So they shared it with one another, they shared it with other archaeologists. But that sharing and reuse typically occurred on that one-on-one basis. It was more limited. This data reuse experience really opened their eyes to the interconnectedness of the life cycle. And it made both the repository and the data reusers consider their practices. It kind of gave them like this 360-degree view of what happens, and some explanation in terms of why in some cases. So for the repository staff, they found that their dissemination format that they used caused problems for data reusers. So they began to think about ways in which they might be able to change that or offer tips in terms of how to use the particular format. In this case, it was CSV. Data reusers reflected on their own documentation practices as well and thought about how they might document in the future. So one talked about using the common standard for tooth measurement. Another talked about being more specific and actually writing down all of the criteria that he used when he was sampling things, when he was deciding bone fusion, when he was deciding tooth wear. And maybe just dropping numeric codes altogether and just starting to write everything out and keeping it in that way. So what does that mean in terms of implications of this study? So the data life cycle is by nature tightly coupled. It's a tightly coupled system, right? What happens in one part of the life cycle affects another, and we've seen this in the case study. That's kind of what we went in thinking, and we were able to see this in the case study. And in contrast, when we think about data producers and data management activities that they perform, those are really loosely coupled. And by that we mean their activities are siloed. They don't think much about other uses or other users of their data. For the data reusers in this project, many began to see, as I said, because they were involved in this project, connections between the different activities. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these reusers were also producers, so they were also sharing their data. So it was kind of this collaborative effort. And meeting at that conference and discussing their data analysis and what they found and some of the issues they ran into in reusing the data is really some of the things that kind of opened their eyes to this process and allowed them to more readily feel and hear what was going on in terms of sharing and reuse. So when we think about other implications, particularly when we think about short and long-term benefits, some of these things came out in the panel yesterday. But there are these individual rewards that we can think about in terms of data reusers. The publication of the article by reusing someone else's data that results from that reuse. We can think about data producers and data archiving and data publication. We can think about repository staff and getting better data submitted. Right? But some of these, in terms of the individual rewards, are actually potential rewards, right? So it depends on that social infrastructure that Fran Berman talked about yesterday. And so that means questioning whether or not archiving and publishing your data are actually recognized and counted when you're going up for promotion and tenure. It depends in terms of reuse and whether or not data reuse is actually considered a respectable way to conduct research within your discipline. So without those things, some of these individual rewards or incentives may fall apart. And then we can also think about science and think about the larger community in terms of short and long-term benefits and gaining new knowledge, given the kinds of research that they're able to do. Other additional short and long-term benefits, for the entire designated community, is having this large data set available for reuse. It's also about increasing the visibility of new archaeological data sharing and data reuse practices, and what you gain from those, the kinds of questions that you can ask. They can now look at the publication and say, wow, they were able to do this kind of work, given the fact that they had access to this amount of data. And for the repository, there are these reputational effects. So this project brought together about 294,000 records of bones across 12 years. Right, so this is one of the largest data sets of its type, and it's a demonstration of the successful working together of repository staff, data producers, and data reusers. And so with that, I'll just acknowledge folks that helped on this in terms of doctoral students, Rebecca Frank and Adam Kreisberg, and Anthea Josias, as well as our study participants. And I think we're going to open it up to questions for everyone. So.